Hello and welcome back to East 315. Today we're talking about geomorphology, terrain, and soils and environmental impact assessment. And today I'm happy to be joined by Colin Middleton, who is our guest lecturer. Colin's got a really great multidisciplinary background. He started his BSc in environmental science at UBC, went on to complete a Bachelor's of Science in Environmental Chemistry at Guelph, and then went back for further upgrading at UBC in soil science and applied biology. He's now a registered professional biologist and professional biologist in BC and Alberta. I worked with Colin at Golder Associates from 2005 to about 2020. We both left the company at around the same time. He's now at a company called Waterline Resources, where he's growing their biophysical business in Western Canada. And today he's going to talk about the exciting and multidisciplinary field of soil science and reclamation, two topics that are really closely linked. So with that, Colin, thanks for joining me and take it away.
Great. Thank you very much, Jerry. Yeah, it's great to see you again. And I wanted to thank you for inviting me to do this guest talk. It's really, it was really fun for me putting this together and hopefully get to share some insights with your students on my world, which is all about soils, geomorphology, and terrain. So the title of my talk is "Who Cares About Soil?" It's a bit of tongue-in-cheek to kick off. I have a blog post series that I put up on LinkedIn about my career as a soil scientist, and something that is often the bane of the soil scientist's existence is that it's often overlooked, but nevertheless very, very important. And so what I'm hoping to do through this talk is to help your students understand why soil science and reclamation is so important in the environmental impact assessment process, and to have a bit more appreciation for this unsung hero of the environmental world. So through this talk, I'm going to weave the case study project that I understand your students are looking at through this course, which is the Site C hydroelectric project in northeastern BC, outside of Fort St. John. I'll talk, and in doing so, I'll talk about baseline and existing environment studies. I'll talk about impact assessments, reclamation and closure planning, which is the primary mitigation for mitigating impacts to soils and terrain. And I'll talk about innovations and future opportunities with respect to geomorphology, terrain, and soils. So my name is Colin Middleton. I'm a senior biologist, reclamation scientist at Waterline Resources Incorporated. We're a 50-person consulting firm that specializes in hydrogeology and contaminated site remediation in Western Canada. I just joined very recently, and I'm excited to help them grow their business in biophysical. I'm a director on the board at the Alberta Society of Professional Biologists. I have been one since about 2018. And it's been exciting for me getting involved in sort of the governance of the practice in Alberta. Certainly learned a lot, and work with a really great group of people who run that association. I have 15 years in the professional services industry, primarily in the disciplines of reclamation and closure planning, regulatory permitting, and environmental compliance on the biophysical side. My technical specialty is soil ecology and soil chemistry. And I've spent a lot of my career doing soil and terrain inventory in Western Canada and a couple interesting projects around the world. The case study setup, I'm sure your students have already seen all this. The Site C hydroelectric dam reservoir is located in northeastern BC, or just outside of Fort St. John on the Peace River. The project need, of course, is that there's hydroelectricity is important for our advanced society. There's a growing need in BC and Alberta for electricity, and this project was considered necessary in the public interest to supply power to residential, commercial, industrial needs. There's application requirements that go along with preparing the impact assessment. The impact assessment is generally done in accordance with the British Columbia Environmental Assessment Office, and Environment Canada has an interest in the project as well. And when we're looking at the geomorphology terrain soils for the area, we're looking at the natural hazards, the natural geohazards. So along this river and the floodplain, there's the potential for landslides, landslips, rotational failures. When you deforest an area to construct the project and its infrastructure, there's an exposure of the soil and terrain, and depending on the stability of that and the amount of rainfall and various other considerations like soil types and textures, there can be increased risk of failures. The whole region is part of the ancient glaciation areas through of the Pleistocene ice sheet from 2 million years ago right up until about 10 to 12,000 years ago when the glaciers retreated and left behind the landscapes that we see in this part of the world. There's a intrinsic land value. The indigenous people of the area see the lands as having cultural significance. There's private land ownership that needs to be dealt with. There's provincial land value as far as agricultural, forestry, and ecosystem services. So the key questions that Jerry has asked me to look at are as follows. Number one, how do you assess changes in terms of significant adverse impacts to soil, terrain, and geomorphology? How do you mitigate those changes? And then how do you reclaim the land after the project is complete and thereby mitigate those changes? To start off, the whole reason why there would be a need to look at the geomorphology, soils, and terrains is because there are public stakeholder concerns. Those include loss of traditional land use, loss of connection to the land, loss of land productivity, loss of wildlife habitat, loss of recreational land use, and the degradation of visual aesthetic. For people that have spent their lives and their ancestors' lives in a particular region, there's an inherent value to the land and to the land being intact and functioning as a wild and naturalized area. So any major project that comes in that would then remove the vegetation, change the topography and the landscapes can create a concern for the users of the land, public, private. So the first thing that we do in order to look at the geomorphology, terrain, and soils is to conduct a background review and to do pre-field mapping. So that involves looking at existing maps of the area. Hopefully there's digital elevation models. Oftentimes the proponent will have detailed remote sensing data that offers high resolution insights into the topography. Lidar data is the primary remote sensing data type that we work with. There's also other kinds of remote sensing information available. Google Earth has an archive of satellite imagery. There's other places where you can get air photos and historical imagery as well. The whole point of this exercise is to understand what was there, how it has changed over time up to the present day, and then that gives you some insight as to how the construction of the project may then change the landscape further. So, for example, if you're working along a river and there's a history of landslides in one particular area along the project site, you want to know where that is, because that may indicate either locations where there may be future failures, or it may provide some insights into understanding the general frequency and severity of natural hazards and landslides, geohazards in the area over time. There's also, depending on where you're working, there's existing polygon bases that would be useful in both BC and Alberta. There are publicly accessible data available on the soil types of the area and the terrain types. The BC has had its entire province mapped at a coarse scale for terrain types, and in selected areas for the soils and land capability. In Alberta, mostly in the agricultural regions of Alberta, there is fairly detailed soil mapping information that provides some insight into the terrain and glacial history as well. So to complete the baseline and existing environment inventories, we're out in the field, going into places where oftentimes have never been developed before. Typically, when you're doing a soil and terrain survey, you're looking for the areas that have never been developed in order to get an understanding of the natural soils and terrain attributes of the area. This can involve going into some pretty remote and rugged places, depending on where the project is going to be. And in my line of work, all of helicopters, 4x4 trucks, Argos, ATVs, and hiking by foot are all fair game. Sometimes you have no choice but to use a helicopter because of how remote the project area is and there are no roads that go into it. Sometimes helicopters are not feasible because there's nowhere to land, or they're in areas where you can't get clearance to fly a helicopter. There's lots of places where soil scientists need to go that require ATVs and Argos because they are well off the beaten path, but there are cut lines from exploration that we use. And if that's not possible, then the only way you can get out there is on foot. And sometimes you're hiking several kilometers a day through completely native forests and mountains, prairies, depending on whether you're allowed to use ATVs or not, to get to the sites that you do your survey. Certainly, because you're doing a lot of work in remote locations, health and safety planning is very important. There's a number of environmental hazards that soil scientists face when they're doing their field work. There's wildlife concerns, environmental hazards such as hot, cold temperatures. I've done soil survey field work in temperatures that have reached over 35 degrees Celsius and below minus 40 degrees Celsius. And you need to understand what you're dealing with in terms of the health and safety risk, but also logistically and practically how you're actually going to complete a soil survey and do your inspection work in those kinds of conditions. There's mine equipment that you need to be working near, that you need to be aware of, need to follow all the health and safety protocols and traffic requirements if you're needing to go through a part of an active mine to access your areas of survey. If you need to be on foot, physical fitness is important. And stress tolerance management is important as well, because they're long days in isolated remote places with usually just one or two other people for long periods of time. The conditions in your work camps are, it's not like it's a 4-star hotel, so you've got to be aware of that going in and be understand that that's kind of what's available to you in order for you to perform your work. And then if you have allergies, and for allergies, if you've got allergies to insect bites, particular bees and wasps, those can be of concern in Western Canada. The tools of the trade, we use a lot of hand tools to do soil survey in the field. shovels, something called Dutch auger, which is just a hand-powered auger that you twist with your arms to dig into the soil. We bring with us some measuring equipment like pH strips, pH and electrical conductivity electrodes. We bring digital data loggers to collect the observational site data that we collect, and log it into those tablet computers that then we can then transfer that data in the evenings or once we're back at the office into our databases for compilation analysis.
Do you typically collect samples when you're hiking off into the woods, or are you just making observations and measurements and bringing your notes back?
Both. So depending on what there's certain criteria that you need to meet as far as how many inspections over a given area you need to complete, and that's often the visual. And then you have to have an understanding of the general soil types that you're expected to encounter, and be prepared to collect samples of the profile on select representative sites. So if you're on foot, you're bringing a backpack with you, and sometimes you'll collect 2 or 3 sites worth of samples and keep that in your backpack, and then carry them back to your muster point or where your Argo is or ATV is parked, and drop them off there, and then go back and take more. So yeah, it can be quite labor intensive depending on what you're doing, and the number of samples you're expected to take for a particular survey. Yeah, it can be fairly physically demanding. And in fact, I think getting the two most difficult terrain types to work in on foot would be in mountainous terrain, where you're going up and down steep slopes, carrying all your gear and soil samples. Sometimes you've got a helicopter that's going to drop you off at some point, and then pick you up at another point. So you've got to go up and down into gullies and around the sides of the mountains to get from one place to another. The other difficult place to work is in deep peatlands, where your foot is sinking down, up to the gunnels of your rubber boots on every step, and carrying 2 or 3 sites worth of soil samples and your shovel and auger and all the rest of it along with you. Yeah, it can be pretty grueling, especially if and add to that you're working in warm. In the summertime, it can be quite warm, and there's lots of bugs, and there's the possibility of encountering wildlife. It's certainly, it's pretty rugged work sometimes, and not for the faint of heart, but can be quite enjoyable and rewarding as well. Despite all that, I do have quite a few great memories working in the field. You wouldn't necessarily
think so. Like an adventure.
It is. Absolutely. Yeah. And right out of school, right out of university, doing field work, young enough that you don't have a family yet, not a lot of ties to my own place. Yeah, it's a great way to see new places, and actually to save quite a bit of money, because everything's paid for when you're in camp and there's nowhere to spend it. So that was definitely some upsides. So yeah, as you mentioned, Jerry, when we're doing our field work, we're collecting soil inspection data in strategic locations. So during the pre-field mapping phase of the work, you are looking at air photos or existing imagery, maybe some existing regional soil maps, and you're then subdividing the polygon base into what's called a pre-field soil map. And that's pre-field soil map basically determines the plan for your soil survey. So depending on the scale of the map that you're producing, depending on the size of the area and the objective of the project, you would be expected to plan your soil survey so that you meet a certain inspection density around the area, as well as meeting a certain rate of polygon visitation. So at each one of those inspections, you then prepare a site description, a soil profile description. So and this is for your soil and terrain and geomorphology surveys. So the soil inspection data, for the site description, you're looking at things like the terrain attributes, slope, gradients, aspect, the surface expression, the landform types, some evidence of the depositional or erosional environment you're in. You're looking at the edaphic regime, so the moisture and the nutrients that you determine based on the site drainage, the types of vegetation that you're seeing, and then some indication of the terrestrial ecosystem. You're also looking to see if there's any evidence of geoprocesses, so avalanche chutes, historical landslides, active landslides, evidence of rotational failures or translational or complex failures, taking photos of the site. And then from there, you're diving into the soil profile description. So this would be if for your students, if they're taking soil science specific classes, they would be learning about things like soil profile description, soil classification, the Canadian system of soil classification. There's a number of different soil classification systems around the world, depending on where you work. There is a world reference base soil classification system as well. But here in Canada, we're usually using the Canadian system of soil classification, and that requires, in order to make those classifications, you need to understand the horizonation. So your litter layers, your L, your F, H layers, your organic layers, your A, B, and C horizons, and the different suffixes that go along with those that provide indication of what types of soils that you're observing. You're looking at texture, the soil structure and consistency, modeling, so redox evidence, coarse fragment estimates, whether you're seeing roots, and if they're, how abundant they are, whether they're fine roots or coarse roots, and whether they go laterally or vertically in the profile. You're looking for effervescence, so that's if you take some dilute hydrochloric acid, put it on the soil, and if it starts fizzing, that indicates the presence of calcium carbonate or carbonates in the soil. That can have implications for reclamation suitability, soil quality, and pH. You're looking for salt crystals. Depending on where you are, you might not expect to see any, so you're not really looking for them. But in other places where you're in saline environments, you need to know how, to what extent visually you can see them. And that you usually, when you see those sorts of things, salt crystals, effervescence, you'll often be at least taking some kind of representative sample so that you have some indication later on, after you have the results back from the lab, what kinds of concentrations you're dealing with on, or what kind of levels you're dealing with for salinity, sodium absorption ratio, calcium carbonate equivalents, and other soil chemistry indicators. And then you're also looking at things like depth to bedrock, which when you're doing terrain geomorphology work, that's important because that can provide some indications to the material that's present that could potentially move. And also, if you're building pipelines, it's necessary for the pipeline engineers to understand, whether or not they need to be concerned about blasting to build the trench, or if they can dig the trench just with the big yellow machines. And along with that, sometimes you're sampling the soil, and like I mentioned earlier, you're usually doing this in tandem with the site descriptions that you're collecting or producing. You're not doing soil sampling at every single site. Usually you've got, a strategy of a certain number of sites you're going to sample, depending on how prevalent the certain soil types were in the pre-field soil mapping exercise. Sometimes you need to adjust that plan as you go. If you're seeing more of one type, or if you encounter a soil type that you didn't map, but is going to need to be reflected somehow in the soil map, you'll need to collect some additional samples. And here we're looking at the physical, chemical, and biological properties. So by and large, up to present day, for impact assessments, typically when you're doing soil samples, you're really just looking at the physical and chemical aspects of it. So you're collecting, you're going to collect samples that will then be analyzed for measures like bulk density. Bulk density you'll try to do in the field, and then you'll verify it in the lab. Bulk density is one of those parameters that there's a lot of struggle in the field to get a good sample and make it representative. Sometimes you end up throwing it out and just relying on the established bulk densities for a particular soil type, because it can be a very difficult measure to do in the field. Collect samples that then get analyzed for particle size, so that's your percent sand, silt, clay, and gravel. Macronutrients such as carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and potassium. Your micronutrients, so those are your trace metals, and things like iron and boron and manganese, aluminum, those sorts of parameters. Sometimes you look at foliar nutrition, not usually at the baseline stage, but sometimes depending on to what extent the environment has already been altered. If there is evidence of nutrient deficiencies, sometimes it's helpful to understand. We have them analyzed for pH, salinity, acidity. So those are generally your chemistry, your physical and chemistry parameters. These days, there's starting to be more discussion around the biological aspects of soil sampling. There's some additional chemistry indicators that are not traditionally done that can be indicative of soil health, particularly the microbe populations. Some indicators that in the last 5-10 years have become a bit more well developed and can be done, on a more readily than they had in the past. There's also techniques that are established for catalog or inventorying soil invertebrates, and then DNA sequencing that can be done on populations of bacteria and fungi.
One of the interesting things about this is the difference between the soil and the aquatic environments are that a lot of the things that you would measure as being essential nutrients then become contaminants as soon as they wash off into the river.
Right.
Environmental impact assessment. The context is everything when you're dealing with these chemicals.
Yeah, no, for sure. Context is everything, and that's why you have different toxicity thresholds or guideline values for each of these constituents, depending on if you're talking, aquatic ecosystems or terrestrial ecosystems, whether it's something that is in the soil but not dissolved in the soil water isn't as big of a problem as something that would be in solution, right? So yeah, definitely a big difference, and very important to keep an eye on those differences, because there's a very wide gap between what would be acceptable in soil versus what's acceptable in water. But it's a really good comparison, though, to compare soil to water, because both are medium for the ecosystem, right? So in the aquatic environment, everything lives within the water, and on the terrestrial environment, everything to some degree relies on the soil. Also relies on water, but the soil remains a critical piece of the terrestrial ecosystem that is really inseparable from the food web, food chain, and the health of the ecosystem generally. All right, so we've done our field work. We're back in the office, and we're now doing the final inventory work. We're mapping geohazards, the terrain and soils, using various conventions that have been developed either regionally, in BC or Alberta. There's a lot of crosstalk between different jurisdictions on some of these standards. For example, in Alberta, there's really, really well-developed conventions for soil mapping. But whereas in BC, there are very, very well-developed conventions for terrain mapping. And so you'll often see the conventions, you'll often see the conventions that have been developed for mapping geohazards and terrain in BC applied to projects everywhere, whether it's throughout Canada or even around the world. I've used the terrain classification system for BC. I've used that on projects as far away as Eastern Europe. Soil map, and on the soil mapping side, depending on the jurisdiction, some have more well-developed mapping requirements than others. As a general common denominator, there's the soil mapping system for Canada. There's the guidance for soil survey and inspection densities, and at what level to map soils at a hierarchical level. These are, if you've taken introductory soil courses, your soil orders, the great groups, subgroups, associations, and series. In Alberta, there's a lot of work that's been done on soil series, where in BC, there's been a lot of work that's been done on soil associations, but not necessarily series to the same extent. It's just because of what makes sense for the types of terrain you're working in, and the types of depositional and erosional environments you're working in. One or the other can make a bit more sense. I'm not going to get into it here though. Soil quality criteria. There's soil quality criteria for contamination, which is different from soil quality criteria for reclamation. Generally speaking, the soil quality criteria for reclamation is more well developed on a ecozone level. Whether if you're working in a boreal forest, we'll have different criteria, soil quality criteria than if you're working in high alpine limestone derived deposits on the Rocky Mountains, versus different soil quality criteria if you're working in the prairies, where you have more naturally occurring salts. So though the requirements or the criteria for contamination are usually based on like toxicity work that's been done over the years, whereas the soil quality criteria for reclamation and environmental impact assessment planning is really more about the natural variation of the soil constituents in a particular geography. The soil quality criteria is really well developed in Alberta, not so much in BC. So there are some criteria, but they've been more extensively looked at in Alberta, and so sometimes you use them, crosstalk between jurisdictions. You look at critical load determination. This has been a subject of increased attention in BC in the last couple of years. We now have better models that have been developed by experts on air emissions effects and acid deposition specialists in an academic setting. Those models are now sort of, I wouldn't call them intuitive, but they're at least now accessible to the consulting industry and professional scientists. So there's an increased interest in understanding the site-specific critical loads for a particular project, and whether or not the soils in a particular area are sensitive to acid deposition or not. The concern with acid deposition is changes in the soil chemistry, namely decrease in pH, and what that does to the mobility of certain constituents in the soil that could then become toxic to plants and or leach into the water bodies in the surrounding area and result in eutrophication and issues like that. Then there's acid rock drainage potential, depending on what kind of mine you're working in. Sometimes the bedrock, when exposed to oxygen, can create acid drainage issues, where you can actually have tailings materials that are creating so much acidity that it's harming not only the immediate vicinity, but getting into the groundwater and creating all kinds of problems for leaching metals going into the system. From a soil point of view, we don't really get into it too much unless it's an area where it's understood at a geochemical level that there's acid rock drainage, and so we then consider the potential impacts to soils as well if there's going to be high acid inputs. And then a soil ecology inventory. I put this at the bottom here. I will say, a bit of a soapbox moment, but really right now there's not very much in the way of soil ecology being done at the environmental impact assessment stage of projects. I think that's a problem, especially as we start to look at reclamation and the needs of the soil in the distant future. We need to understand the biodiversity in the soil, the key species that drive the nutrient cycling dynamics in the soil, and then what are the conditions that would limit them or provide advantages to their reestablishment in the reclaimed landscape. So I think in years going into the future, I think you should start to expect to see some more investigation into soil ecology in environmental impact assessments. And I think this is mainly because the biodiversity is such an important part of an environmental impact assessment, and so much of the biodiversity in a terrestrial ecosystem is in the soil. For a long time, we really didn't have very good or very, I'd say, accessible techniques for inventorying and analyzing soil for diversity, but that's changed quite a bit, especially now that there's DNA sequencing that has just exploded in the last 15 years, and there's a lot of interest now on understanding the importance of the relationships within the soil to ecosystem health generally. So the next part of this, so now that we've done our baseline, we know what's there now. Now we need to understand how the project is going to affect it. And the first, I'd say, philosophical question that we come to in looking at soil in an impact assessment is whether or not soils is a value component or not. And Jerry, I recall one of your recent lectures on the topic of selecting value components and how you go about selecting them. This is where values meets the science, and who decides what is a valued component. So in my line of work and experience, whether or not soils is considered a value component in and of itself really depends on who you're working for and where you're working. So in the oil sands, for example, every single impact assessment I've ever worked on since 2005, soils in some way has been considered a value component. And that means from your baseline and in your impact assessment, you're doing everything in the environmental consequence matrix, which I'll talk about a little later. You're looking at soil quality in terms of the soil's ability to be resilient to change, to resilient in the face of disturbance, and the probable success of reclamation down the road. You're also looking at soil quantity, and soil quantity is about you're stripping the land, you're stripping the soil, you're storing that soil. While that soil is in stockpile, there's going to be losses due to erosion. It's going to decompose over time. And when you go to respread it, you may be respreading it on landforms that did not exist when the project started. So the actual surface area that you need to reclaim on will have different properties, and that not only the aerial extent of that of the reclaimed landscape, but also the strength of the slopes and whether or not it's feasible or safe to respread the soil. So you can have situations where your reclaimed substrate that you're going to be developing reclaimed ecosystems on doesn't actually have any, original topsoil that's been stored, and you're really just starting from scratch. The picture here is only sort of relevant to this, but it just kind of it provides just an overview of the soil types, that the soil orders that exist in BC as they've been mapped, and each one of these soil types has certain advantages or disadvantages for different types of land uses, and they're usually tied to a combination of the depositional or erosional environment, the topography and elevation ranges, and the biogeoclimatic zones that you're interested in. So I think really the first philosophical question for your students in this talk is soils a value component? And it's something that you can debate, many different ways. And as a soil scientist, certainly I've been caught in the middle of this debate. Personally, I'm a soil scientist, so obviously I see the soil in itself as being valuable to the ecosystem. There's a general recognition that soils is important, but sometimes depending on where you're working, soils will not be a valued component in and of itself, but instead will be measured, and those measured changes will then inform the assessment of other value components. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So one way or another, soils is considered and included, but it really comes down to what is the inherent value of soil to the land users, to the regulators, to the proponent, and to the public at large on a particular project. And I think really, who is to say? I don't have the full answer to that. Certainly, it depends, and I think depending on where you sit, what's been done in the past at a particular site sometimes drives what's going to be done in the future. That old adage of upholding the status quo versus innovation. There's a general reluctance to change what has been done in the past if it's worked at a particular site in the future. And this is sort of where the politics meets the science as well. And from my point of view, one of the places where I think there can be headway in kind of understanding this is around the soil ecology and understanding soil biodiversity and understanding the ecosystem services that soils provides to the landscape generally, that you can really start to kind of formalize and understand it better. But I'd be interested to know what your students think.
And maybe we'll take a poll at the end of this course, because I got the same issue with water quality, which is what I normally work on. And everybody cares about water quality, but do they really care about it for intrinsic value, or do they care about it because of human health and fish and everything else that's living in it? So it's an almost identical or parallel conversation.
Yeah, I think parallel would be, it's certainly analogous. And I think this goes for the components in an impact assessment that are the media upon which life depends and within which life exists. So air, water, and soil, those are the three. They all have essentially analogous arguments as far as how do you go about assessing impacts. But generally speaking, I'm going to kind of come back to the Site C example, or many of the other impact assessments that have been done in British Columbia. In my experience, usually in British Columbia, soils are not considered a value component. They're considered, but they are evaluated as part of the impact assessment as measurement endpoints. So we measure a series of indicators, and the results of those changes at the project level then get forwarded to the linked disciplines for use in their assessments of impacts at the assessment endpoint level, which are related to the components that have value components. So measurement endpoints. These are your changes in soil quantity and distribution. So there's going to be, you've mapped soil types across the landscape. You're then going to, your project is going to require the stripping and removal or burial of a certain extent of soil. Will that soil be replaced in the same way? Will the landscape change such that that's not possible? And so you're assessing those changes. And generally speaking, if you take natural soil that has been developed over the course of the last 5 to 10,000 years, as soon as you strip that soil, and if you replace it back, from a technical point of view, you can no longer call that same soil the same thing anymore. So the soil quantity and distribution will instantly change simply by virtue of it being disturbed. It goes from a natural soil that's classified as your luvisols, your brunosols, or podsols, or whatever have you. You replace them by man-made means. Now all of a sudden they have an entirely different classification. So just by that simple virtue, you're changing the quantity and distribution. We're also looking at changes in soil quality, and as I mentioned, really at this point we're looking at changes in chemical and physical properties that would influence the ability of the soil to support reclamation efforts. This is also where you might look at substrates that will not have soil replaced. So you're now looking at, is that a bare rock environment? Is it waste rock or overburden that's been piled somewhere? What does the surface look like at reclamation as far as the physical and chemical properties ability to support reclamation efforts? So that's how you're assessing that. So you're looking at things like changes in land capability evaluations, which is a kind of an algorithm. There's a couple different algorithms that have been developed over the years to look at how soils are suitable for forestry or for agriculture. You're looking at the criteria matrix for soil for reclamation parameters, pH, looking at organic matter, soil texture, structure and consistency. If you have a soil structure that has gone through the freezing and drying cycles over many hundreds, thousands of years, the water will infiltrate through that soil differently than it would if that exact same particle size distribution has been compacted, compressed, tilled or disturbed and then replaced in some way. Will have different infiltration characteristics. And then, other things, other parameters. And again, like I mentioned earlier, up to the present day, we're not really talking about soil ecology and biodiversity when it comes to soil quality. However, that's something that, I hope through this talk, a bit of this, and on my soapbox, like this is something that I think should be looked at more closely in the future. And here, so changes in soil biodiversity. So this is, if you take a soil and you take, let's say, for example, you strip 100 hectares of topsoil. That topsoil has, from a native soil environment and from a forested setting, you've got mites, you've got spiders, you've got fungi, you've got bacteria, you've got nematodes, worms, all kinds of soil invertebrates that are critical to the nutrient cycling of the system, that are all part of that soil when you strip it and put it into a stockpile. In that stockpile, the majority of the soil goes into an anaerobic state because in the forest setting, the first 15 to 30 centimeters is where all the life is, and that's where and that's all aerobic and exposed to oxygen. Put it into a stockpile, only the top of that stockpile is in an aerobic state. Everything else is anaerobic. So any of the organisms that rely on oxygen are going to die off pretty quickly. The bacteria that's in the soil, the population dynamics of the bacteria change very quickly and very drastically, favoring bacteria that reduce minerals rather than oxidizing them. So it changes the game for the soil in a major way. You then take that soil and you replace on a reclaimed landscape. Mind you, the bacteria, like usually they're pretty hardy and they'll kind of rebound relatively quickly, faster than anything else. But all of those species that, all the invertebrates, any of the oxygen consuming species that have died off, you now need to let that recover, and there's a lag there, and that lag depends on a lot of factors that are mostly discussed right now in the academic literature, but there's insights that you can glean from what's happening in reclamation studies and some of the applied research that's being done to kind of understand what you're dealing with in a reclaimed setting. We like to think that once you put the soil back, it just rebounds really quickly and everything's fine, but it's not necessarily the case. And in the biodiversity in particular, after disturbances as large as soil stripping and storage, you have quite a change that you then need to understand the dynamics of in order to properly plan reclamation efforts so that they're successful. The last measurement endpoint is changes to geomorphology and terrain. And this is changes in the slope gradients, slope changes in the aspects. So in a mountainous environment, especially in the northern latitudes, if you change the amount of north-facing slopes versus the amount of south-facing slopes, it's going to have an impact on what kinds of vegetation can grow. It's going to have an impact on the moisture regimes of those areas. North-facing slopes are going to be cooler and wetter than south-facing slopes, as an example. So those sorts of things need to be taken into account when you're looking at changes and reclamation planning. And so then assessment endpoints. And again, this comes back to the question of whether or not soils are a value component in and of themselves. But nevertheless, there's a number of different linkages to other disciplines that need to be considered in other components of the impact assessment. So with respect to changes to soil quantity distribution, I'm not going to go through every single one here, but you'll get a kind of a common theme. The direct linkages are vegetation and wetlands, as far as loss changes in soils and landscapes, loss of wildlife habitat. There's loss of biodiversity, potential for acid deposition and dust deposition, and in the project description, there's linkages to the closure reclamation plan. And similarly here with changes to soil quality and soil biodiversity, here there's a linkage to aquatic health on the erosion sedimentation aspects of the project, and with geochemistry on the reclamation suitability of the reclaimed landscape. If you're looking at a waste rock pile, which is then going to become a reclamation substrate, what is the quality of that substrate? And on the closure reclamation front, you're looking at mitigation, restoration, monitoring, and intervention. And on the geomorphology and terrain side of things, similar to previous measurement endpoints, add in the major hazards. So looking at geohazards and erosion, these are your landslides, landslips, and larger failures, and the erosion potential of the environment that's now may have steeper slopes, may have more exposed soil, that it needs to be considered. The soil types need to be considered. And then on the closure reclamation plan, you're still looking at revegetation planning. So provided that in when you're doing your value components, you've got soils quality or soil quantity listed as a value component. You're now looking at environmental consequences and significant adverse effects. So for each of the assessment endpoints, you would then look at the environmental consequence matrix tables. You would look at the outcomes of residual effects before and after mitigations are applied. I trust a lot of this stuff Jerry's gone through, you've gone through already with the class as far as impact assessment methodology.
Well, a lot of it, yeah, in different lectures.
Right, okay. And then, so we're looking at residual effects classifications, accidents and malfunctions, which interestingly are not part of the, are not necessarily part of the residual effect classification. I'll talk a little bit about that. Monitoring and confidence and uncertainty. So the residual effect classification is, after you've, either before or after you've applied the mitigations, how severe is the impact, how likely is it, and all that. Generally speaking, accidents and malfunctions are considered like, if you applied your mitigations, then there shouldn't be an accident or malfunction. If there is one, then it's kind of outside the scope of the impact assessment, so that it's treated differently. This is sort of why, this is sort of why on the news, when you hear about like a pipeline leaking or something, and you say like, well, this pipeline leaked a whole bunch of oil into the landscape and it's causing all this damage. The environmental impact assessment said there would be no residual impacts, right? And it's sort of said as sort of almost ironically, like, or sort of as a gotcha. But really, the accidents and malfunctions, if the project was working properly, there wasn't the casing in the pipeline, didn't fail, or the joins in the pipelines didn't fail, then you're basing your residual impact classification on that, not on what would happen in an unexpected or rare or catastrophic scenario. So, but you look at them different. You look at them separately. You still acknowledge the possibility, but you've already applied the relevant mitigations, so that at the point where you are looking at the residual effect classification, you don't have to consider what would happen if there was a major spill or a major leak. Monitoring, there may be some issues around, say, erosion or reclamation uncertainty that you want to understand. So you're going to monitor reclamation efforts over time, and so you can come up with some kind of plan to intervene if things aren't going the way you expect. And then confidence uncertainty. This is where you basically say, how confident are we in the impact assessment that we've produced? What kinds of uncertainties exist in the baseline data that we're dealing with, and what kinds of uncertainties are there in the outcomes of the assessment. So environmental impact mitigation. So this is where this I would say provides the lion's share of the mitigations for soils, terrain, and geomorphology. At this point, you're looking at developing management plans that go along with the application or will be developed in advance of or during construction. Management plans for soil salvage and storage, erosion control plans that will mitigate erosion. So, where are the hot spots for erosion after you've stripped away the vegetation? How are you going to make sure that those sites don't become problematic? So, shoring up the slopes or installing erosion control blankets, doing bioengineering on slopes, that sort of thing. Getting hydroseeding done or seeding to native grass species as soon as possible to get a root mat going to prevent erosion. Preventing accidents and malfunctions. So that's basically these come around. What are the specifications for the installation and construction of the pipelines, or what are the operating requirements for the mine fleet trucks. Like, are you going to be having designated fueling locations, and will those designated fueling locations have a berm around them? Will there be spill kits available on site? How large of a spill does there have to be of a certain kind of fluid in order to trigger a reportable incident, and what do you do about it, and that sort of thing. Also, at this stage, commitments to interim reclamation. So once you've cleared an area, but you're no longer using it, but you might still disturb it again way down the road, you might do interim reclamation to stabilize the surface, to limit erosion, and to help get keep the soil active and healthy through the course of the project. There's closure landscape design, creating realistic geomorphic features in the landscape, and land reclamation. So that's construction of closure landforms, doing soil replacement and revegetation efforts. So after all that, after you've applied your mitigations, then you're looking at the final residual environmental consequence and significant adverse effects. And again, if you are looking at soils as a value component, this is where you would do an assessment of significance. If you're not using soils as a value component, then you would not produce an indication of significance, or sorry, an assessment of significance. You would instead take all of the results from your measurement endpoints that you've measured the changes to all the different parameters, and you'd send those off to the other disciplines for their assessments. Yeah, if you got them as value components, then you're going to look at what is the impact to soil quality and quantity due to the project, and what are the implications for that. Just another note on environmental consequences, significant adverse effects. I know it's a bit disjointed here, but I wanted to show the mitigations as before I got to the discussion of environmental consequence, because usually you're doing it both before mitigations and after mitigations are applied. And so these environmental consequence tables, you're looking at magnitude and severity, geographical extent, the frequency of the effect, how the duration, the reversibility. And each of these, in a particular region, in a particular jurisdiction, you'll probably see a very, very similar approach to each of these 5 bullets applied. Like, for example, magnitude of severity will be based on, the percentage of the local study area that's being affected. Or the geographical extent, is it limited to just the local study area, or will it, or are there potential offsite consequences? But those will change depending on what jurisdiction you're in and what are the particular unique soil issues. For example, if you're looking at soil quantity, then soil quantity, it makes sense that you're looking at either an absolute number of hectares of loss, or some percentage of the local study area, which is somewhat ambiguous, and there's some debate around that, around how you define that as well. But then those would be reasonable for magnitude. Whereas if you're looking at soil quality, the magnitude can't be really tied to an area. The magnitude is then tied to some change relative to baseline condition, or some change relative to an established reclamation quality criteria. So, let's say you're looking at soil quality and you're looking at soil pH. So if pH changes by 1 pH unit relative to baseline, that might be a low magnitude. 2 units, a moderate magnitude. 3 units, a severe or a high magnitude. So, and then each of your parameters, you'd have to kind of come up with some system for how to determine magnitude. In the world of a soil scientist, the magnitude really is the one that generally drives the environmental consequence, because the geographical extent is generally always limited to the project site, even for issues like erosion and air emissions effects and dust deposition. Usually those are localized effects around the project. The frequency is usually, how often are you disturbing the soil? It's usually just once per unit area, because that when you clear the soil is when you are then using that piece of land for for construction of the project. And then the duration of the effect is generally, long lasting because the effect lasts well into the closure period. And the reversibility will, it's either reversible or it's not. Some things are reversible. Things like some of the physical and chemical properties would be reversible. Biodiversity, debatable whether it's reversible or not. We don't have much to go on to determine that, and that's one of the reasons why I think in the future it is important to understand that from an impact assessment point of view. Also, some things like permafrost, for example, generally irreversible at the soil surface. So that will influence a little bit, whether or not what the environmental consequence is. But for soils, geomorphology, in my experience, generally it's the magnitude or severity of the change that drives whether or not there would be a significant adverse effect. Okay, so land reclamation and closure planning, we're looking at regulatory process, public stakeholders, and practical considerations. On the land reclamation, there's a whole bunch of different techniques that have been developed. We're looking at soil salvage, storage, reclamation techniques, overstripping and peat mineral mixes in areas where there's a lot of peatlands, such as the oil sands, direct placement versus stockpiling. Direct placement, generally speaking, is much preferred because the soil biota, the seed bank, the soil is still alive when you salvage it, and if you can transplant it to a new area right away, it will remain so. Versus in stockpiling, you're going to have some benefit to the from a soil chemistry and soil physical point of view. The soil biology will be impacted, so it'll take longer. There'll be a longer lag period upon reclamation before you get the ecosystem diversity and resilience that you're looking for. There's soil amendments that are commercially available. I've seen a bunch pitched to me over the years, various fertilizers, slow release, fast release fertilizers, organic fertilizers, alfalfa pellets, all kinds of different things. Coarse woody debris has been something that has started to be salvaged in the oil sands about 10 years ago. And I think that started to spread to other jurisdictions because they realized that there's a lot of value in the decomposing woody debris from the trees that the non-merchantable timber, particularly with respect to microhabitat for soil invertebrates and smaller vascular and non-vascular plants, and microhabitats for other wildlife species that would come and colonize. They're nurse sites for establishing vegetation. And generally speaking, there's been a lot of really encouraging research that's been done over the last 10 years on this front. And soil material balances. This is dynamic modeling along with the mine plan. So oftentimes you're working with the mine planning team to understand, where the soil is being salvaged from, where it's going to be stored, how long it's going to be stored, once it's done being stored, where is it going to be placed, and all those sorts of things. And that's a very large GIS exercise that the soil and reclamation scientist is involved with. On land reclamation, so just another note on soil ecology and biogeochemical restoration. There's been a lot of work over the last decade or so on the biogeochemical processes of reclamation, especially after major disturbances, such as completely clearing a site of soil. As you saw in the earlier slides on the Site C Dam, that whole side slope of the Peace River Valley has been completely changed. So the reclamation of that site, will require some consideration of the biogeochemical processes that will go into proper restoration. The research has largely been done on pioneer species, understanding how nitrogen fixing species are important at the early stages of ecological restoration to put nitric acid into the soils to help bring the soil pH down, so that other native plant species can establish. It's one of the main reasons why you'll get weed infestations after clearance, is because they're pioneer species, and they fix their own nitrogen, so they live in very nutrient poor environments, and they're a necessary part of the ecosystem. But if they're not native to the area, they can invade and persist and be very difficult to get rid of. So working with those ecological processes from the beginning of the reclamation right through to restoration is very important. Also, there's been ecological research done over the years, and a lot of it very, not even recent, but work done on chronosequences, looking at, how primary succession takes place on moraines of a known age, is something that soil scientists in BC have been working on for a while, and similarly with ecologists that have done work on primary succession over the last century. And those concepts are actually finally getting a bit more traction in understanding what is best for the ecosystem for reclamation. There's also soil inoculants, and these would fall into the category of soil amendments, but there are some commercially cultured symbionts that you can spread in the soil, and they'll help fix nitrogen. They'll work with the nitrogen fixers, pioneer species in the soil, and help kind of get things going quickly. So generally speaking, I put this little image up. This is a chronosequence of what land reclamation looks like after a major disturbance, and you're looking at long time scales, right? So you're not looking at, we put the land back, we plant some trees and shrubs, we walk away and everything's fine. It takes quite a while, and 75 years to a mature forest is about right, assuming that nothing's really gone wrong. But even at that 75 years, depending on what you've got as far as soil ecology, soil health going in, 75 years may be a mature forest stand, but it won't have the biodiversity that the natural ecosystem does. And so all the more reason to be looking at soil ecology right from the get-go. There have been some interesting innovations over the years. The biggest one, I think, in my line of work has been how prominent remote sensing techniques such as Lidar data capture has become. Just about every project I work on now, there's Lidar data available to generate a high resolution digital elevation model. Back when I started, it was the tail end of the days of doing using a stereoscope and looking at stereo pair of air photos and drawing lines on a transparency sheet of plastic and then digitizing those in GIS. Lidar has really changed the game, allowing us to do a lot of work right in GIS without the need for that work of working with stereo air photos. There's electromagnetic surveys that are done on a case-by-case basis to help understand things like permafrost, to help understand depth of bedrock, and so on. Drone surveys are becoming more common on smaller sites. You can develop pretty good digital elevation models for a site using that. You can also do some land reclamation assessment in some harder to reach locations, or you can fly a pipeline, for example, really quickly. Whereas if you're to do it on foot or try to get in there by truck or helicopter, it can be very expensive and time consuming. And just other kinds of remote sensing techniques that are really helping things. And then also, like a theme throughout this talk, looking at soil biodiversity. So is this a VC or is it not? And if we're looking at soil biodiversity, is that potentially a game changer for the soil assessment and kind of resolving that debate over whether or not soil is a VC or not? There's a number of insect species and gastropods that are on the species at risk list, that some of which have some stage of their life cycle in the soil that are important to understand. There hasn't been that much work done on them, unfortunately, to really understand it on a project by project basis. But with the techniques that have been developed over the years on how to isolate and even qualitatively assess soil biodiversity, I think we're at the point now where we can credibly do some really good work on impact assessments with it. And I wanted to just give a quick plug to the UBC Below Ground Ecosystem Group. This is a group of prominent Canadian soil biodiversity researchers headed by Drs. Grayson, Prescott, Chanway, and Simard. I've had the privilege of either hearing a few of these individuals speak at conferences, or was a student of Chris Chanway in soil biology class. I think this group and this lab is really important in advancing the discipline of soil biodiversity in Western Canada. I think you guys are quite lucky to have this group as part of your university, and hopefully check out what they're up to and what they've contributed to ecological science. Just thank you. So thank you very much for inviting me and for having me give this lecture. It's a real privilege for me, especially considering that I was once a student at UBC. If you're interested in my career as a soil scientist, you can check out my 12-part blog available on LinkedIn called Who Cares About Soil? And just finally, thank you to Waterline Resources Incorporated for sponsoring this talk and my time to develop it. We're a group of about 50 specialists in hydrogeology and contaminated site remediation that are active throughout Western Canada, in particular Alberta and BC. Thank you very much, Jerry.
And the big question that'll be on everybody's mind is, do you hire BSc grads from Earth and Environmental Science programs?
Yeah, I absolutely. I don't see why not. I mean, it's interesting kind of career paths, and where you get plugged into the working world versus staying in an academic environment, how to decide whether or not to get a job in your field or to go get a master's or a PhD. I am somebody that doesn't have a master's degree, doesn't have a PhD, but I got a Bachelor of Science degree, and I just followed the opportunity. I went where the work was. I learned from my mentors over the years, got opportunities to work on some really interesting projects that have helped advance my career. And the reason why I got to where I am today is mainly from being flexible and willing to contribute where I can. And that you'll find as you get into the working world, there's an awful lot of work to be done, and it really depends on whether you're willing and able to take the opportunities that come your way when they come your way, and worry about some of the broader aspects of your career development a little later on. But getting your feet wet and getting some work experience is first step. And Waterline, we have a team of people that some have bachelors, some have masters, some have PhDs, all levels of their career, all stages and levels of their career. I think the biggest opportunities for people that are interested in learning their discipline and getting into doing some field work, that's where a good place to start.
Well, I certainly appreciate your contribution here today. It's been a really interesting talk, and certainly a topic, while I do care about soil, I certainly wouldn't have been able to give it the justice that you've done. So thanks again, and look forward to seeing you again.
Great. Thank you very much, Jerry.